Okay, so we're going to talk about intervals of increasing and decreasing. So these are the portions of the graph where your y values are going up and down. When your y values are going up, we say that it is increasing, and when they're going down, we say that your y values are decreasing. Now, when we report whether your y values are increasing or decreasing, we always need to write it in set notation, but we always are going to be reporting out the x values for where the y values are increasing and decreasing. So let's try it with our graphs that we have examples for. So graph number 1. A tip of when we're trying to identify the intervals of increasing or decreasing is you want to try to split your graph up into sections. For number 1, we have 2 sections. We have this section until we hit this low spot here. And then we have this section for the rest of our graph. Now, when we are reporting the intervals of increasing and decreasing, we should always start at the leftmost portion of your of each section. So for the blue section, we're going to start at this left point here, and then we're going to trace with our pencil what's happening. So what's happening with my pencil or this red line? It is going down. So that is an interval of decreasing. And what we do is in that blue section, we report the x values of where the graph is decreasing. So in that blue section, my leftmost x value, since it's trending this way, is going to be negative infinity. We're not reporting the y values. Yeah, the y value is going to be infinity because it's going up and up forever, but we are reporting the x values. And the leftmost x value is, since there's an arrow, it's going towards the negative infinity side and on the x-axis. So I have negative infinity all the way down to the x value. My rightmost x value in that blue section is 0. Now let's move on to the pink section of the graph. We start at the leftmost point of that pink section, which is right here. And then we trace and we see that this red line is going up. So that's an interval of increasing. And so we're going to report the leftmost x value and the rightmost x value within that pink section. So my leftmost x value within that pink section would be 0. And the rightmost point x value in that section, since it has an arrow, it's going to be trending towards this side on my x-axis, and that's towards the infinity portion of my x-axis. So my intervals of increasing is from 0 to infinity. Okay, we're going to do this again, but this time we're going to do it with number 2. So for question number 2, a reminder, when we're doing intervals of increasing and decreasing, we're going to split it up into sections. So for this graph, one of my sections will be here until I hit that low spot. Another section will be here until I hit that high spot. And then my last section to the end of the graph. So we're going to start with the blue section, start with the leftmost point, and my pencil is going down. So this is an interval of decreasing. Reporting the leftmost point in that blue section, since it has an arrow, that means it's trending towards the negative infinity sign on my x-axis. So it starts at negative infinity and goes to the rightmost x value in that blue section is negative 3. Now we're going to work with the pink section. So start with the leftmost point in the pink section. And what's happening is my pencil's going up, or this red line's going up. So that's an interval of increasing. My leftmost x value in this red section, or in this pink section, sorry, is negative 3. And my rightmost x value in this pink section is in between 3 and 4, or 2 and 3, sorry. So that's about a 2 1/2, which is the same as 5/2. Okay, then my last section is the yellow section. Start with your leftmost point, and what's happening is my pencil, or this red line's going down, so that's another interval of decreasing. Reporting the leftmost x value, that's going to be 2 1/2 or a 5/2. And my rightmost x value, since it has an arrow, that means it's going to keep going out and out forever, so it's trending towards the infinity part on my x-axis. So 5/2 to infinity. All right, switching gears to the next page. We are going to do this now for questions 3 and 4. For question 3, we are going to have 2 sections of your graph. One of your sections is this part. Your other section is this part. So we start with the leftmost point on each section. So for the blue section, starting with the leftmost point, my pencil is going up, so that's an interval of increasing. And we report the left and right x values. So my left x value is 0 in that blue section. My right x value, this is going to continue going towards infinity on my x-axis. Now, jumping to my pink section, we start with the leftmost point, and if we trace that with our pencil, it's going down, so this is an interval of decreasing. And I report my leftmost x value, which is 0, and my rightmost x value, since there's an arrow, it's going to keep going and trending towards infinity. So my interval of increasing and decreasing was exactly the same for this one, and sometimes it can be. All right, and then the last one, number 4. So I'm going to have 3 sections on this graph. My first section is this one here till I hit a low spot. My next section is in between the low and the high spot. And my last section is the high spot to the end of the graph. All right, so starting in my blue section, the leftmost point, this time I don't have an arrow on the end of that, but tracing that with my pencil, I'm going down, so that's an interval of decreasing. And my leftmost x value, even though it's an open dot, we're going to still report it as -4, 2, all the way to, it's in between -2 and -3, so that's a -2 1/2, which is the same thing as a -5/2. Okay, jumping to my pink section, starting with the leftmost point, I'm tracing it with my pencil and it looks like it's going up. So that's an interval of increasing. So that's in between the x value of -2 1/2 or a -5/2 all the way to the x value of 2. And then my yellow section, starting at my leftmost point, my pencil's decreasing, so that's another interval of decreasing. My leftmost x value in that yellow section is 2. My rightmost x value in that section, now this is, again, we're not reporting the y values. Some of you guys might say -infinity, but that's not correct, because this is going to keep stretching out and stretching out and stretching out and going this way. So that's trending towards my infinity on my x-axis. All right. Now, I might jump around to get some more in with this video. So, I'm not going to go through intervals of positive and negative until next video. Let's talk about maximums and minimums. There are 2 different types of maximums and minimums. An absolute maximum is the absolute highest point on your graph. An absolute minimum is the absolute lowest point on the graph. Now, a relative maximum is any peak on your graph. So there may be some high spots, but it's not the absolute high spot. That would be a relative maximum. Same with the relative minimum. That would be a low spot on your graph, but not the absolute, not the lowest point on your graph. So let's go through and do those for each of these. So number one, absolute minimum. The absolute lowest point on this graph is 0, 0. So there is an absolute minimum. It is 0, 0. Now the absolute highest point on your graph, well, we see these arrows on the top of our graph. That means it's going to go all the way up to infinity in my y-axis. So there is no absolute maximum because this graph's going to continue on forever and ever upwards. So there's not a point on this graph where it completely reaches an end or a highest point. So there is no absolute maximum. Now, relative minimum, just because we have the 0, 0 being an absolute minimum, it could also be considered a relative minimum. Any low spot or any low point on your graph would be a relative minimum. So yes, there's a relative minimum, and that's 0, 0. And then relative maximum, there is no peak. A peak would look something like this, where there's a high spot on the graph. There is none. So this would be no. All right, moving on to number 2. Absolute minimum. Well, we see this arrow at the way bottom of our graph. That means this is going to go down and down forever, which means there's no stopping point to this graph. There's no lowest point on this graph because it's going to go all the way to negative infinity. So there is no absolute minimum. Absolute maximum. While some of you may be looking at this as your absolute maximum, unfortunately that's not, because this arrow is going to reach higher than that. And so since there's an arrow reaching up and up forever and ever, there is no absolute maximum. Now, relative minimum, I see a low spot on my graph right here. So that is a relative minimum because this particular section of the graph hits a low point. So we do have a relative minimum, and that is the ordered pair -3, 0. Relative maximum, I do see a peak or a high point on the graph. So we do have a relative maximum, and that is the point. It's about 2.5, so that's a 5/2. And then your y value is 150. All right, moving on to the next page. Number 3, absolute min. Now this is going to go down and down forever and ever. So since we have that arrow on the bottom, there is no absolute minimum. Same thing with the absolute maximum. It's going to go up and up forever and ever. So since there's an arrow on the end here, there is no absolute maximum. Now, if we turn this graph sideways, there would be a low spot on the graph or a high spot. But we can't turn this graph sideways to make it fit where there's a relative min and max. There is no peak or no low spot on this graph, so there's no relative min or max. All right, and lastly, number 4. Now the absolute minimum. The lowest point on this graph has an arrow, so there is no absolute minimum. Now the absolute maximum, there's not an arrow going up. There's not an arrow there. So there is an absolute max, and that's this point right here, which is the ordered pair 2, 4. Now relative minimum, I do see a low spot on the graph, which is -5/2, -4. And relative max, I see a point there, a peak, 2, 4.